All right, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you how your computer can get hacked if it's not connected to the internet. A lot of this stuff is kind of theory. Some of it kind of applies more to like governments and corporations. Very little of it would apply to home users, but there is a couple of methods that can affect home users. So I'm going to go through that and let's go ahead and get started. So when I say air-gapped computers can be hacked, basically air-gapped means there's absolutely no sort of wireless signal or internet connection whatsoever. So that includes anything like Wi-Fi, Ethernet, Bluetooth, any sort of wireless signal, anything like that. So there's no internet attacks whatsoever. And so where you'll end up seeing this basically be used is like if it's a big corporation and they're protecting some sort of financial thing or government protecting classified information or something like that. So people like Nvidia and Intel would use it because they have sensitive IP. They wouldn't want to have people steal. So they've got to be really particular with how they set their networks up. And then home users would probably use air gapping for something like if they're going to run systems that are unsecure, like let's say you like to play retro games, the 16-bit games they were made for Windows 95, but you can't run them on a modern 64-bit operating system. You'll just get an error if you try to do that. But those are obviously systems that you wouldn't want to have exposed to the internet because it could let a lot of nasty crap into your network. And so an air-gapped computer is basically anything that's isolated. And so in the context of like a government or a corporation, it's going to end up being in a secure area. And there's also times where you can end up having SCIFs, like any sort of classified information gets put inside of a SCIF. And that's so what it is it's called a sensitive compartmented information facility. It's some government lingo. So you could go read about this on Wikipedia if you want to, but there's a couple of movies that showed it. There was one called The Courier. It had the guy from the Marvels in there. I can't remember his name, Benedict Cumberbatch. And there was one scene in there, it's a spy movie that takes place during the Cold War, and they showed a scene of a SCIF in there at the embassy, like the American embassy that's in the Soviet Union, like halfway through the movie. And then there was also a SCIF that was shown in the movie Eagle Eye that was made quite a few years ago with Shia LaBeouf. And those rooms have all sorts of features built in to help prevent any sort of spying. So they've got like sound dampening, shielding for the electronic cables and stuff like that. They protect against a whole bunch of stuff, and we're going to go through that here pretty soon. But let's go ahead and start with stuff that can affect home users, because I know home users might think, okay, well, I don't really have to worry about this. Like, most of this is for information. This isn't really anything that affects home users all that much, but it could affect home users, and it doesn't even have to be air gapped. So one of the things I'm going to talk about here is you can get viruses from things like USB drives. You could get it from DVDs, but I don't think most people use those anymore. I don't think most people even have a DVD drive on their computer these days. You can get it from malicious direct memory access devices. And then what can happen is you can end up with a low level compromise. So you can end up with like boot kits and root kits. This is where they take hold in your boot drive, the EFI files that like Windows creates, and it can bypass things like BitLocker. I covered that a while back on the Eufy malware. Black Lotus. Granted, that was a slightly different situation, but it's just an example of things that can happen. And so here's what, like as a home user, here's what you have to be careful of when you're going and buying stuff. You've got to be careful about not buying knockoff garbage storage devices. I saw a thread on Reddit here recently, and someone was making a joke. I think they said a family member had bought like 3 or 4 of the cheap garbage drives off of Amazon that were marked down super cheap. They had some kind of weird brand name, and they said they got them for super cheap. And they were wondering what was going to happen with them. And basically, it was on a cybersecurity Reddit, and so people were like, "Okay, well, you could end up with malicious DMA devices or something like that that could take over your computer." And not all the time is stuff going to be fake, but you really want to avoid that stuff. And so this also goes for both internal and external drives. Is people will go and buy like because they see like these SSDs or hard drives for super cheap. And one of the things that can happen with that is they can put in malicious firmware into the hard drive itself. So no matter what kind of how good of antivirus you have or anything like that, your system will always be compromised because the malicious firmware, you can't get rid of it. It's on the hard drive itself. And the other thing that can come up is like these custom peripherals or like the cheap, crappy peripherals. So that includes things like keyboards, mice, USB drives. I'm sure people have probably seen this. I don't know how many people use things like Razer, but Razer products, for example, if you plug in a Razer keyboard or a Razer mouse, Windows will start giving you pop-ups. Oh, do you want to install Razer software? It's because they embed Razer firmware in those devices. And if you're buying cheap, crappy garbage, is they can put malicious firmware on those devices, and then it can install malware on your machine when you don't even know about it. And another example of that, of like firmware being able to have embedded stuff, like if you buy an Asus motherboard, I think most motherboards do this, but I know for sure Asus does it, is when you install Windows, there will be something like Asus Update Checker or whatever the Asus motherboard stuff is. I always have to block this stuff when I come up on computers that I'm working on, is block if being able to access the internet, because they, basically then it will just download the crap software on the computer that Asus has. And it's because they embed that stuff on the firmware to install their stuff. But that's just an example of attackers can do the same thing, sell malicious devices and a bunch of crap. And actually, to give you a perfect example of this, there is this article here from the EFF urging the FTC to stop resellers of malware on. So it talked in the article about how there's those set-top boxes. So whatever those little, I don't watch TV, but whatever those little TV boxes are that you can get for Android. And I think it's called like Fire TV sticks would be an example of one. And then it says also mobile devices, and they're being pre-infected with malware. And this is what I keep saying is don't cheap out on stuff. If you buy cheap garbage, you're going to pay a price one way or another. And a lot of times they're infecting this stuff with malware ahead of time. And then so direct memory access could be anything like Thunderbolt ports. So anything that you plug into a Thunderbolt port. An example of that would be like a docking station, because docking stations, one of the things that I see quite a bit is people will get like those hubs that you can plug like 10 different USB drives in. Again, make sure you're buying from a reputable seller and a reputable brand if you're going to do that. And then also PCI and PCIe cards are also direct memory access, meaning that they can access memory directly as soon as like the computer boots up. They don't have to go through any sort of a screening process like when you boot into Windows, especially like if you have memory integrity turned on. Like the applications that are running have to be checked before they can go and do anything with computer memory. Direct memory access just means that they can go right through those checks and compromise anything that's being ran. This one's kind of an interesting one. There's something called a TEMPEST attack, and basically it's like taking electromagnetic radiation and it reconstructs data. So there's, to give you some examples, my Google foo is not that strong because I was going to try and pull this up to show people. This is something that NSA does, and it still is considered top secret. Like basically people know about it. I think this was one of the things that came out from the Snowden revelations. People know about it, but they don't really know any of the details about it because it's still classified. There's still a lot of stuff that's not known about it. I would suggest if you want to go read this article. It's actually a pretty interesting read. It goes through like the history of how this stuff was even found out. It goes back to World War II, and then it kind of goes into a little bit of the modern day stuff. And I wanted to show people there's a picture that I saw a few years ago. And I tried doing some Googling, and I guess I couldn't Google the right keywords that I needed to try and find it. But an example of this would be like the older computers used to use something called a VGA cable. If you're relatively new to computers, there's been these different types of cables. So you had like VGI cables, DVI cables, and then we went to HDMI, and now there's like DisplayPort. But VGA was one of the old specifications where you plug it into like the old school graphics cards. And there's a picture of that I wanted to show people where this spy device that the government uses it's able to take this thing, and you can point this device at a monitor. You don't even have to have a view of the monitor itself. You can just point it in the direction of a monitor, and it will pretty much perfectly recreate what is on that monitor on the spy's monitor. And so, like I said, there's really nothing that's known about this. There hasn't really been anything new that's came out about this. But I can pretty much guarantee people, like, I would recommend people go watch the Edward Snowden movie that came out, I think it was about 10 years ago now. It was actually a pretty good movie. But with them having tools like X-Keyscore, I guarantee that they have something now. There's got to be something now where, like, they've got a device that can do this with HDMI and DisplayPort monitors. They just don't talk about it, but considering that that's been like 15 years ago since those leaks came out. I guarantee you, whatever they have now is way more powerful than what was basically revealed back then. And so the way that they'll work around stuff like that is they'll have things like Faraday cages, and then they have to shield the cables against that kind of attack. And there's actually hardware that's Tempest certified, but this obviously isn't something for consumers. I think this is pretty much like government technology here. You can't buy it as like a civilian. I think that speaks well enough that it's enough of a threat that even like the US government or like a big enterprise would need to buy hardware like that to protect themselves against any sort of attack like that. This next one is also pretty interesting because there was an example called BadBIOS. So I'll pull up that article here real quick. This was considered like a faulty analysis of things. I'm not going to go through the whole thing here. You can go read it. It's a very short article. Basically, the premise, they thought that like this was all made up. It says here, it's possible that this is real or it could be an elaborate hoax. Basically, the premise of it is you would be able to use malware to create ultrasonic sound waves that can exfiltrate data through sound waves. So the sound from a compromised PC, like an air-gapped PC, would be able to come from the speakers and then get picked up by a mic on another computer that's probably compromised. And the data rate was really slow. I think it goes at like 20 bytes per second is about all that, in theory, they were able to do. This has been like, the research showed that it could actually work. So basically, I think spy agencies probably do have this, but it's not something that is really on the civilian market, at least at this time. Now, the next thing is like a network attack. So this would basically have anything to do with a supply chain attack. So like I was talking up here, this would be an example of a supply chain attack because you think that you're getting a good piece of hardware, but it actually has malware pre-installed on it. And so this can be anything like a network card, USB drive, etc. And it can also be something that creates a wireless channel on modified hardware. So the hardware could be modified to have a Wi-Fi signal built in. You can buy these little USB, basically like little USB drives now. I've used them before where you plug it in and it's like a Wi-Fi access point so it can connect to your router. Like on computers of old, you used to have to use PCI cards, and now you can use these tiny little USB drives. So you could buy something like what you think is going to be a normal USB drive, but it's actually had the hardware modified. It sends out a wireless signal that can get picked up long range from another device. So it could be someone sitting in a building across from a person that's able to pick up that wireless signal and download data off of that air-gapped computer. And again, I know this stuff might sound far-fetched, and also I'm just going to say this. I know some of the stuff that I talk about in these videos kind of gives the impression that home users need to be worried. You don't. I'm telling you guys, this is not stuff that home users need to be worried about. This is more of like mostly theoretical unless you buy like crappy hardware from Amazon or eBay that's been tampered with. But an example of this, again, here's an older article that it came out back in 2014. Photos of an NSA upgrade factory show Cisco router getting implant. I think what was going on here is they were intercepting hardware that Cisco was sending out to like foreign governments and foreign corporations that the NSA wanted to keep an eye on. And so they were putting these devices in there, see all of the traffic and what was going on with whoever it was that the NSA wanted to keep an eye on. I know people get like really deep into conspiracy theories and oh, they're spying on American citizens, and like, I'm not going to get into all that on this video. They have legitimate reasons to do this stuff. I don't see why people need to get all worked up about it. Like, yes, this stuff's going to happen, and there's not a damn thing that me or you can do about it, so why worry about it? That's the way that I look at it. Now, the next thing is thermal attacks. So this can be where malware can create heat and then be basically translated to like binary code with temperature fluctuation. So think of like malware this would be something like extremely advanced. Like this is something that really only a nation state actor would be able to make, and I'll talk about that stuff in a minute. It would basically be like you get a piece of malware on your computer. It causes like, let's say one of the components to heat up. In theory, this is how it would work. Then they could sit with a thermal camera, So ideally you would need to have like a line of sight through like a window or something where that thermal camera is aimed at the computer and then it can pull binary code off there. I know this stuff sounds really far-fetched. I don't think there's any instances of this being out in the wild of like this actually being used. It was considered proof of concept. Like it actually can be done. The data transfer is really slow and the distance is really short. But again, I think this is where you'll end up seeing governments being able to use this. And then the last one before we talk about an example of something is optical. So this is data that gets transferred in binary from LED flashes. And an example of this, I was trying, again, something that I couldn't find. I saw this on YouTube a while back where it was one of those HID devices. HID is a brand where you can get like access cards and stuff like that. So like when you go into like, let's say a secure area, there will be one of those little boxes that sits next to a door with a magnetic lock. You go up with a key card, you swipe it. If your card is given access to that area, then the door unlocks. But those HID boxes that you set up by those doors have little LEDs that flash really fast. And there is this YouTube video. People might be able to find it. I couldn't find it because I wanted to show it for this video here. But they give out flashes. They flash really fast. Well, they showed this attack. They showed how they did it. They were able to get and I'm probably not explaining this really well, but they were able to get basically like the passcode for the door. And then they were able to replicate what they needed to be able to go then access a secure area by basically mimicking a actual access card, but they came up with their own based on the data they were able to pull off those LED flashes. And in theory, the same thing could probably apply to like your little power and your reset buttons and activity buttons on your computer. Again, for normal home users, don't worry about this crap. Now, this is something that can work from quite a distance away. So on the YouTube video that I saw, they were sitting pretty far away. I think it was like anywhere between 50 and 100 feet away where they just had a small camera set up and they were recording the flashes that this HID box was giving off. And then the other thing of like optical, I don't know how many people have played Splinter Cell. It's one of my favorite all-time games. Because I remember when I first played the game back when it came out in 2001, of those the laser device that you'd aim at like, I think it was the third mission in where you got it, where you aimed it at the elevator as the two of the guys were going up the elevator and you're listening on their conversation. That stuff actually does exist, and there's people that have been able to build crude examples of that, and they've got it on YouTube. You can go find it if you want to. The government and like spy agencies, stuff like that, they have access to like super advanced versions of that shit. And so again, mentioning the SCIF again, this is the reason why they have stuff like that. The enemies of another country use these type of devices, and so that's why they have to build these SCIFs, is so that people can't eavesdrop on sensitive conversations. Like when you have to go through the trouble of making stuff like this, there's a good reason why. It's because like governments, for example, do have to deal with this stuff quite a bit. And so now I'll just give you like a quick example. A lot of people might already be familiar with this. If not, then I'll just cover it real quick. There is some malware quite a few years ago that ended up being called Stuxnet, and the prevailing theory is that it came from Mossad. Maybe US intelligence agencies were the ones that worked on it, but people think that it was at least Mossad were the people that really thought this up and worked on it. It was an extremely advanced piece of malware, and it spread through the Iranian uranium enrichment facility through a compromised USB drive. And the stuff was able to spread quietly. So what it would do is it would install on one machine, and then the way the malware was written is it would not do anything. It was waiting until a certain time to activate, but then one of those machines the malware would be written to infect up to 3 other machines from that one machine, but no more than those 3 machines. Super advanced piece of malware. And it was, like I said, it was also set up to where it wouldn't activate until a certain date. And the malware was also set up so it would delete itself if it did not detect Siemens software, which Siemens software is used for like industrial type applications. So in this case, like a uranium enrichment facility. And so when it detected that, then once the malware activated, is what it would do is it would change the speed of the centrifuges to damage them, but it would send normal operating systems to the monitoring devices, so it would delay the detection. And what it ended up doing was, I think it destroyed quite a few of the centrifuges. I know it set the Iranian nuclear program back quite a ways. There's a really, really long write-up of it on Wikipedia if you're interested in reading about it. It's actually a pretty interesting story. This is an example of something super advanced, and like I was saying, that people don't need to worry about the majority of this stuff. This is stuff that you're going to see from like a nation state actor. This isn't stuff like, you're not going to see malware like this from your typical script kiddie, for example. An example of something that would, I would say, be kind of close to this would be like the Black Lotus malware that I covered a while back. And that's been patched out now. Like Secure Boot has been patched to prevent that crap from happening to people's computers. So again, like for home users, you don't really need to worry about that stuff. But all this stuff like Tempest, the BadBIOS, the thermal attacks, optical attacks, this is stuff that like a government would need to worry about, but not a home user. As a home user, what you have to be careful of is basically like supply chain attacks. So meaning you're buying cheap hardware that could be infected. This is why I say again, pick reputable manufacturers and also reputable suppliers, because if you're buying it from, let's say you're buying what you think is a good piece of hardware, and I've bought stuff from eBay before, but the problem is that you're taking a risk that if someone really wanted to, if they had the technical skill and the know-how and they really wanted to screw with someone, is they could, in theory, tamper with that hardware if they were good enough, or it could be a group that's selling hardware that's tampered with and they're using it to spy on people and install malware. Again, I don't want people to go down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole. You really don't need to worry about this stuff. Just something that I thought would be interesting to talk about in a video. Anyway, that wraps this video up. I hope that this was of some interest to you and you think a little bit more about where you're buying your hardware from. This is also probably one of the reasons I know people kind of hate on Apple quite a bit, but to be fair to Apple is I think they do realize that this is a risk, because Android devices, if you go take a look at news articles of like the Google Play Store and some of these crappy Google devices, there's a reason why Apple is so strict with what they will allow. Like, they don't want people changing around their hardware because they do realize this is a risk factor, that people could mess with this stuff. And they do realize that people could, if they opened up their stuff for like side loading, that it potentially could bring up some sort of tampering. I know there's people that are going to go down the comments and get all butthurt. It's like, okay, well, if you don't want Apple stuff, don't buy it. There's plenty of Android stuff out there that you can buy. No one forces you to use Apple. It's just like people that will complain about Nvidia because of their prices or whatever their business practices are. It's like, no one's forcing you to buy a specific brand. And the approach that I take is let people use whatever they want to. I don't believe in brand loyalty, because none of these corporations give a shit about the consumer. So why would you care about them? At least that's the way that I look at it. But anyway, now that I've probably caused some, for the 5 people that are watching, I'm sure one probably got upset about something that I said. Anyway, with all that being said, hope you found this video interesting, and I will see you on Monday.